You know, it reminds me of Alice in Wonderland. The little potion bottles, drink me and eat me. One of them makes you taller, the other one makes you smaller. It's like that, except one of them takes really good photos, and the other one takes really good photos. Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I'm David Bird with Reality Reimagined. I'm an award-winning photographer and Photoshop artist that specializes in fantasy composite art. I use the Canon EOS R as my main camera for all the work that I do. The Canon EOS R was the first full-frame mirrorless camera that was heavily marketed by Canon as they entered into the mirrorless market. And when they launched the Canon EOS R, they also launched an entire new line of lenses because the Canon EOS R mount inside the camera and the lenses are now known as RF mounts and RF lenses, different from their predecessors, the EF mount and EF lenses. When the lenses launched, they were reputed to be significantly better than the EF lineup in every way. The optics, the colors, the details, it was just the new wave of the future for lenses. But they were also significantly more expensive than the camera bodies themselves. Now, that's not too unusual if a lens is a larger, bigger lens, but in some cases, the RF smaller portrait lenses were significantly more expensive than the Canon EOS R or the RP that shortly launched after the R itself. I use an EF 24-70mm Mark II F2.8 lens as my workhorse lens for every genre of photography that I cover. I absolutely love that lens. And I use it with a free adapter that came with the Canon EOS R and the RP that allowed you to connect EF lenses to the RF mount inside the body. I considered getting the RF equivalent to this lens when it launched, but again, it was significantly more expensive. So I decided to go on a journey for information. I rented the RF 24-70 and I set up 2 photo sessions. For both photo sessions, I set the camera on a tripod, framed up my shot, took one frame, and then quickly switched the lenses with nothing else changing in the frame so that I could essentially compare and contrast between both of these lenses. The first session was inside the studio because I just wanted to get a lighting controlled environment baseline look at these 2 lenses, looking at things like the pixels, the details, the colors, and so forth. The second session I did outside in the middle of the afternoon in the Arizona sun because I wanted to see how much I could actually push the lenses and the details in Photoshop, how much I could move the pixels around, paying attention to things like shadows and highlights and so forth. Now, that's going to depend more on the sensor in the camera than the lenses, but again, the lenses are reputed to be significantly better, so I wanted to do that test outside. Now, as much as I'm tempted to clickbait you and make you watch the entire video before I tell you my opinion, I'm just going to tell you up front, they're almost the same. There is a difference between the RF that is slightly better, but they're almost the same. And since I currently have the EF Mark II 24-70mm lens, I don't think I'm going to be switching to the RF, but let's take a look at Photoshop. Let's take a look at these images. Go on the journey with me and you make the decision for yourself. If you already have an EF Mark II 24-70 and you consider going to an RF lens, you'll get a chance to look at these. If you already have the RF lens, you don't even have an EF, well then great, you can look at this and argue with me in the comments below if you want to. And if you're not a Canon user, sorry. And we're in Lightroom and we're not in Photoshop. And this is future Dave because past Dave did not realize how difficult it is to take 2 separate images and do a side-by-side comparison of them in Photoshop. You can take an image and do a before and after view in Adobe Camera Raw, but not 2 separate images. So if you know how to do that in Photoshop, let me know in the comments below because I would love to learn how to do that. However, it is very easy to take 2 separate images and do the side-by-side comparison in Adobe Lightroom, hence why we're in the program. We're going to start with the images that were inside the studio and the lighting controlled environment. This is my wonderful friend Kiara. You've seen her in some of the previous videos here on the channel. If you'd like to follow her work, look at the Instagram account at the link below. So the first image, the image that will be on the left, is the EF version of the image. The image on the right will be the RF version. So I'm going to select both of these, do the side by side. Let's go ahead and zoom in just a little bit. And as I've already stated, the RF is just a touch stronger. I'm seeing a little bit more sharpness in the image and differences in the contrast and the overall colors and luminosity values. but the margin between them is so close that I'm not seeing this massive, significant change. And again, keep in mind, the RF lenses were heavily marketed to be better than the EF line in many different ways. But this isn't like EF Dorothy Gale in Kansas and then RF Dorothy in the land of Oz. Like, they're just super close to each other. It's not a massive change as far as I can see here on my computer. And hopefully that's transcribing to you in the video here on YouTube. So the sharpness, I think, might be a little bit of a visual bias because I'm noticing those contrasting color changes and luminosity changes. But to bring the images together as a baseline, we could simply, in the raw processing, take the contrast slider, the vibrance and saturation sliders, maybe even like texture or clarity, and push them by like 2 or 3 points, 5 points at the most, and it should bring the images into a baseline. And as far as continuing to edit the images, I know one could say, well, if you have to bring the EF by those points up to the RF just to meet the baseline, aren't you shortening the distance of how much you can push the pixels even further in artistic processing with the image itself? We're talking such a minuscule change that no, it's not going to be that big of a difference. So there's not going to be a fidelity loss in the pixels because you have to bring the baseline up to match the RF. So looking at these, I feel like they're so close to each other, that margin is so close that I don't see a massive change or difference. Let's move on to the images that were photographed outside in the natural light environment. So this image shot outside, this is my wonderful friend Janelle. You have not seen her in any videos here on the channel as of yet, but we did a workshop together that I hosted in Phoenix several months ago. She's a wonderful talent, both as a model and as a pageant model. She mentors young ladies who are stepping into pageants. She's a great human being. So look at the Instagram account at the link below to follow her work. So this is the EF version of the image. Let's go ahead and select the RF, and then we'll do the side-by-side comparison. Again, looking at these, I'm seeing something that's just a touch interesting here, but before I go into that, let me explain that there is a lot of color shift and issues in color right now at the baseline of these images. They have not been processed at all, and that's because yours truly did not photograph a gray card when I did this session, because it was 5:45 in the afternoon in Phoenix and it was 115 degrees outside. It was incredibly stupid of me to say, let's go out and shoot in hell's furnace and take beautiful photos for the YouTube. So we shot some images at 5:45. We drank a ton of water, and then we waited for the golden hour so I could get more images of her in a couple of different looks, both for my own personal portfolio and for hers. But looking at this, if I would have done a gray card, we wouldn't have such wonky colors. But it's a good thing, because what I'm seeing, and the differences here, again, the image on the left is the EF, the one on the right is the RF. The RF doesn't feel as saturated. It doesn't feel as strong. It feels, if anything, more neutral, and the EF feels, for lack of a better word, more processed. And they have not been changed. They have not been altered at all. And the transition time between switching the lenses was so quick that the sun didn't move. Her hair moved ever so slightly because there was wind blowing, but she held perfectly still. I mean, these are roughly the same image. That noticeable color and contrast variance in the EF to the RF, do I look at it and say, well, the EF looks better? Not really, because I know that if I wanted to match the baseline to the RF, all I have to do is just move it a couple of points. Sharpness, everything pretty much is on key. So my intention with these images and for the video was to take both the EF and the RF of these images outside and process them through Adobe Camera Raw, taking out shadows and highlights and all that kind of fliz, just to see if we could push the pixels to notice a difference there. Whether we started seeing artifacts faster in the pixels, noise and so forth within the overall image, to designate that the EF was somehow inferior to the RF. But unfortunately, you cannot do a side-by-side comparison of processing images of two separate images doing the before and after. You can't do it even in Lightroom. So you can do it one image at a time doing the before and after, but you can't do it with two separate images. So what I want to do is, let's go back to the single view. We'll grab the RF image. Let's go to the develop module, and let's just look at this as I would start to normally process this file, doing some of the basic things that I would choose to do before I went into Photoshop to start doing a full-on edit for the image. Now keep in mind, I don't use Lightroom. I use Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop for all the digital photo editing that I do. There's nothing wrong with Lightroom. I never really used it. So I always have used Photoshop, but the develop module in Lightroom is identical to the one in Camera Raw. The develop module in Lightroom was built off of Camera Raw. So it's pretty much the same kind of process I would do for raw processing. So I'm going to take the shadows out of this image just a little bit because I want to see a little bit more detail in those shadows there. And boy, I really wish I would have photographed a gray car, but I think if I spent like 1 more minute in the sun, she and I would have just spontaneously caught fire. So I'm going to take the white point up. Let's bring the highlights a touch down, because it's just a little too strong here on the right side of her face. Overall exposure, we could probably just push just a little bit. And contrast, we can definitely push that up just a touch. Let's bring the black point, and let's bring it in and increase it just a touch. Let's increase that white point and take some of those shadows out just a little bit more. Texture is already strong to begin with, but we could push it up just a little bit more, which would give us just a little bit more overall visual sharpness to the image itself. Vibrance and saturation looks good. Now, of course, this needs to be color corrected because I didn't photograph the gray car because I didn't want to melt and die. So I think it all looks fine at this point. Let's go ahead and zoom all the way out so we can see it. There's more work to be done in the background itself as a masked layer and stuff to make this a beautiful image, a full-on retouch and so forth. If you're not familiar with retouching at all in Adobe Photoshop, you should take a look at the card above. That will take you to the retouching series here on the YouTube channel for Reimagined. But as I look at this RF image, I think it's great. I think it's a beautiful picture. And if I go and look at this EF image and process it to be the same, I think it's a beautiful picture and it looks great. So let's have some final thoughts and finish up this video for today in comparing the EF and the RF versions of the 24-70 f2.8 lens from Canon. At the time of this recording, the EF 24-70 f2.8 Mark II Canon lens is $1,700, $1,700 brand new. The RF 24-70 f2.8 lens is $2,200 because it's currently $100 off from Canon, a $500 difference. For me, I already have the Mark II, the EF Mark II. I do not feel the need to spend an extra $500 to upgrade to the RF lens. If you're a person who is coming from the Mark I version of the EF 24-70 2.8 and you're looking for an upgrade and you have the budget, I would definitely recommend the RF lens because it's the newest and best. But to that point, I want to stress this. How I purchase gear, photography gear for my career. When we started, we didn't have a lot of money, so we had to make those purchases very carefully. And we approached it from two important parameters. Number one, we needed to make sure whatever gear we purchased would be able to service the different genres of photography that we chose to cover and make money from. And number two, we knew that that gear had to last a long time because we couldn't afford to just buy the next best thing that came along. So when the RF lenses came out, I was looking for a massive change, and I was sincerely hoping it would be. Now, when I started, I had the EF 24-70 f2.8 Mark I lens, and it was my workhorse lens. I had it for a long time. And when I upgraded to the Mark II, it was a night and day difference. It was massive in the changes, to the point that I lamented that I did not make that change sooner. So when the RF 24-70 came out, I thought, okay, it says it's supposed to be this amazing. Let's do it. Let's look at it. And I'm glad that I took the time to rent this lens and test it because ultimately, for me, I do not feel the need to make that change right now. The RF lens is definitely positioned, that entire line is positioned toward filmmakers. Yes, it's certainly applicable to photographers, but it's positioned toward filmmakers. One, the camera's a little bit lighter because of the RF mount. Number two, you have the control ring on the outside of the lens. The control ring is near the zoom ring on the lens itself, and that control ring can be programmed to be any of the major functions inside the camera. So like you can change the ISO, the f-stop, the shutter speed. As a photographer, I would never use that because if I'm shooting a burst of images and I set that control ring to like the f-stop on my camera and I bump it and change it, I'm gonna be a sad panda when I look at all those files and find out that they're screwed. So it's something that, knowing where it's positioned, why it's positioned from Canon, knowing the price differences, and now seeing this comparison, it's just not something that I want to purchase and step into. Don't get me wrong, if you want to and you want to have the best gear, it takes beautiful photos, amazing photos, and so does the EF. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you like the content you found in the video, make sure to give the video a like and consider subscribing to the channel because new content will debut each week in photography and Photoshop education. And when you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell icon to be notified of that new content when you return to the YouTubes. Thanks again, and until next time, I'll see you out there in the world of Photoshop.